the dreaded group presentation. How do you give a group presentation? You've got 4, 5, 6, sometimes voices that you need to coherently organize into one speech. Hard. Well, it's not so bad. We'll talk about 4 different things that you can think about when you're building your group presentation logistically to help ensure the group's success. The first thing is, how are you going to break up the work? A lot of groups are tempted to just each person takes a main point of the presentation and does their research, writes up their point, and presents that. Well, what can be difficult about that is that each person has a totally different style of presenting and doing research and citing their sources sometimes. So it can feel a little bit disjointed when people just have these chunks. So it's always good if you do want to chunk your presentation and have each person talk about a different main point to have oversight from another person in your group. So looking over their point, adding things, adjusting language to help smooth things out. Otherwise, you could have someone in your group go through your outline and look to see what everyone presented and do a little bit of tweaking to make it sound like there's kind of one coherent narrator for this presentation. Another approach is to have people kind of group up into teams and each take on a couple of main points. So they're working together to establish what their main claim for that point is, or their topic sentence is, and they're working together to find research to fill in. So first, you have to figure out how you want to break it up. In terms of breaking up the introduction and conclusion, it can be really nice to have the same person who introduces the presentation provide the conclusion. It's kind of like putting bookends on the presentation. It's also useful because if you were to use a story or some other personal bit to open to grab the audience's attention, then to have the same speaker recall that narrative or talk more about that personal thing they mentioned can be really useful. How are you going to break up the main points? The second thing is, how are you going to introduce the group members? That's one of the things that we have to do in our introductions. We want to introduce everybody and ideally build their credibility. You have, again, 2 different options for that. You can have one person introduce the whole group. So you could say something like, our names are Chris, Bailey, Rachel, Nick, and Carrie, and we are all in different areas of customer service. Today, So we give each person by name and we say that we're in customer service if our presentation is about how to make a sale or something like that. We have another option where we could have each person introduce themselves. So one group member would want to say, so our group consists of 4 people. My name is Bailey and I'm in customer service in this area. The next person will say, my name is such and such. I'm in customer service in this area. And each person introduces themselves from there. The first person to introduce themselves could also say something like, our group consists of people from a wide variety of customer service backgrounds. My name is Bailey, and And each person introduces themselves in that way. Kind of depends on what your group wants to do. The next thing that we have to do is preview our main points. We want to be really explicit with previewing our main points. We want to say, the first thing we're going to talk about is this. The second thing we're going to talk about is that. The third thing we're going to talk about is that. If you have the presentation set up in chunks, so each person is presenting a main point, you can then say something like, Bailey is going to talk about this point, then so-and-so is going to talk about this point, then the last person is going to talk about that point. That's a way of doing that. A lot of groups are tempted to, in their introductions to each group member, then also say what that person is going to talk about, but it can become very overwhelming for the audience. So just introduce each person, and then if your preview of main points comes immediately after that, which it can, otherwise you could put like a relevance to the audience statement, then in your preview, acknowledge who is going to say what. If you've decided to not break it up so that each speaker has a main point, you can just say something like, we're going to take turns presenting information to you today on a few different topics. The first is blank, blank, and blank. So then the audience knows that people are going to be jumping around and they don't have to anticipate who is going to speak first. A final thing to think about when you're doing the logistics for your group project is transitions. We really want to have strong transitions, because otherwise it does start to feel like random speakers are just presenting at the audience. It can be really hard for them to keep track of what's going on. For example, you just said your preview of main points and you want to pass it off to the first speaker. You can literally say, now I'm going to pass it off to Bailey, and she's going to talk about the importance of using customers' names. And then Bailey can say, like so-and-so said, using customers' names is incredibly important when in sales. Or I can just start in then with the topic sentence, because the audience has already been previewed with it. When I'm done giving my main point, it is really important for me to pass it off to the next person. So I could say something like, now that you know how important it is to use customers' names when making sales, I'm going to pass it off to my partner, so-and-so, and they're going to talk about the importance of follow-up calls, something like that. We're taking the audience, holding their hand literally from point A to point B. Having these strong directional transitions is also really helpful if our speakers kind of are forgetful or don't know who is going next, or there's just some awkward thing that happens. If I forget to pass it off to the next speaker can say something like, thanks for telling us about the importance of using customers' names, Bailey. Now I'm going to talk about blah, 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 blah. So it's kind of like a checks and balances. If one person forgets, the other person can come through and explain, give the transition for the next person. Finally, at the end of the presentation, we have our review of main points. It's less important there to say, now you heard Bailey talk about the importance of this, you heard Chris talk about the importance of that. Hearing the speakers' names is less important there, but it can be useful. The names are more important on the front end because the audience is kind of like associating your name with a topic that you're going to be talking about, and it helps them prepare for the information that they're going to get. At the end, they've already gotten that information, so unless you're anticipating a lot of questions that might be directed at specific people, restating the names is a little bit less important. Take a deep breath. Your group presentations will be fine in the workplace and in your classes. It's all going to be good if you just follow along with these 4 key considerations, which is, how are you going to break up the points? How are you going to introduce the speakers and talk about their credibility? How are you going to preview the main points? And how are you going to transition between speakers? Good luck.